The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Good morning. Thank you. I'm here on behalf of Father Warren's request to do a presentation today on Francis. He's already done my introduction. In case some of you who know me, hear me as usually Mr. or Dr. or Vincent Rummelard. He always pronounces Father Warren my name in the way my French-Canadian ancestry did, Rémillard. I appreciate that. I first of all want to say that we are going to be having a class on St. Francis, as has been announced, but I want to repeat that it will take place on 3 consecutive Thursdays, March 3rd of this week, March 10th, and March 17th. And these classes will be held, as Father has announced, in the parish hall. There's been some confusion about that, so I just want to make sure I repeat it to you. And it will be on Zoom. Why am I doing this? Might be a good question you could ask me. So I'll try to answer it right away. What are my credentials in doing this and sponsoring such a class? Well, I was a professor at St. Francis University for 40 years, but I was not in the Department of Religious Studies. Franciscans surrounded me. They were my colleagues. They were my students sometimes, and they were my friends. So my knowledge of Franciscanism is largely experiential and not academic. So you don't have to be afraid of that. However, I do have a son who is a professor of religious studies at St. Francis University now. And so I'm going to ask him to pick up all the pieces that I wouldn't be able to provide you with in the academic. Okay, Father Warren, and just a few words about why we're sponsoring this class. Father Warren had asked us at the very first meeting of the vestry, what is St. Francis in the Valley known for that makes it unique among Green Valley churches? This very question was the one asked by Father Warren in our most recent newsletter, which I am sure you've all read. I quote, in case you haven't, "We are one church of many local churches that do good works and ministries. But what are we doing that immediately identifies us to others in terms of our work and of our ministry?" In response to this question, my personal reply in the vestry was that the uniqueness of our parish may lie right before our eyes. That is, in our parish name, St. Francis, and in the current works and ministries that we offer in this parish. So how do we go about connecting who we are and what we do with the name of St. Francis? Well, to begin, Father Warren has already begun to envision organizing our work and ministries under a Franciscan ministry umbrella. Father Warren has alluded to this in more recent sermons and will be explaining the organization of that umbrella further as time goes on. My role, on the other hand, will be to begin to look at the life and example of St. Francis so as to help us focus our energies on the model of St. Francis as it relates to the heart and hands of Christ, which is our parish model. With that in mind, we will be having a class on St. Francis, what he set out to do, and how that may serve as a guide to our parish in the future. The outline of the three classes will be the following. My son, Dr. Art Remillard, professor of religious studies at St. Francis University, who teaches a course on faith and Franciscanism that covers he will be the one that will cover the life, times, and works of St. Francis. On the second Thursday, we will want to continue with Francis's life because it's so very interesting and had such great effect in the world. And not only on the events of his life, but especially his character and values in writings. And I assure you, he was a very, very interesting character. Third Thursday, we will explore how Francis fits in our world today and how our parish may exemplify Franciscan values in the future. Let's talk about the hearts and hands of Christ and Francis and how those come together. At the hands of Christ, we see Francis in his life providing aid to the lepers. That was ghastly. Descriptions of lepers are people who are not only rotting before their eyes, but they smelled horribly. To walk into that, nobody really wanted to ever walk into that kind of a situation. But he willingly did it because it was there that he saw the face of Christ. Who are our lepers today? Here at St. Francis and in our community. Our lepers are the poor, the broken, the marginalized, the sick, whom we serve in several ways, through our telecare program, through many Franciscan ministries that address youth, seniors, and to the migrants via the Border Institute. As for our community and its needs, we address that in the Stephen Ministry and the Food Bank. We also see Francis in his life negotiating peace with the Sultan during one of the Crusades. No, we're not going to send you to go see Vladimir Putin to tell him to get out of the Ukraine, will we? No. But what we can address peace with is with something like a covenant that has been created and exemplifies peace, dealing with the relationships among our own family members and our parish members. Barbara Bundy on our vestry is working to make and create that covenant and make it a more imminent, real presence in our parish. Finally, we witnessed Francis in his life showing an intimate relationship with the environment, animal life, vegetation, and resources as something that we must preserve and not exploit indiscriminately. In our parish, we have addressed the use of energy in the installation of solar panels. And currently, Christy Mannix, who's sitting to my right, has created a 5-year plan in our landscaping efforts. These are just some of the examples of the hands of Christ in our parish, but they also reflect the heart of Christ. Francis's life objective was to discover the very nature of Christ, the very DNA of which Christ was made. He didn't know that term. We know it today. For us, Francis provides an example of a spiritual culture, not as something you need to define and display, but more like, and now you're going to enter my academic specialty, more like how a language usually operates in everyday life. That is, it's something that happens while you're busy doing something else. You don't think of language every time you do speak, do you? Of course not. And that's what that means. And by the way, I think that was a quote from John Lennon, of all people. Language is reflected when we respond to something said by saying, hey, that's common sense. That's natural. That's rational. That's reasonable. All those kinds of things. Once you are saying that, what you're really expressing is your cultural model of what reality is. I first realized this, my wife's grandfather, for example, who lived in rural Vermont, very rural Vermont, who immediately went to the aid of a farmer whose barn had just burned down. He never thought of it. He just knew that is what you have to do. Personally, and especially with Joyce, and when Joyce and I were living in France, I more than once realized that what I thought was common sense, what I thought was natural, what I thought was rational, what I thought was reasonable, was not what the French considered so. Likewise, Franciscan spirituality may mean adopting different cultural standards that become part of you and your subconscious. What I'm alluding to herein is directly related to our scriptural readings today on transfiguration. Moses underwent a facial transfiguration after talking with God. Paul says the following: when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. And in the gospel today, Luke's gospel describes the actual transfiguration of Jesus. This was a transfiguration from a person who then becomes something more than that person actually is. He was actually transformed in that moment into being the very Son of God before the apostles' eyes. I hope that our class in St. Francis will serve, as it has done for me, as a transfigurative event in your spiritual and material lives. In the words of St. Francis of Assisi, pax et bonum, peace and good be with you. Thank you.